I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast Special Edition. This summer, in addition to our regular episodes, we have a series of interviews with authors whose books made our list of the 100 best books of the 21st century. And this is our final one in the series, and it's a wonderful one to end on. This week I'm joined by Isabel Wilkerson, author of the 2010 book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. It is the best nonfiction book of this century, as chosen by just over 500 respondents to our poll from earlier this summer. Isabel is the former Chicago bureau chief for the New York Times. She's a winner of a Pulitzer Prize in feature writing, and she's the author of the 2020 book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Isabel, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Your book took its title from Richard Wright, the author of Black Boy. When did you know that was the title? Very evocative. Were there other titles that were in the running?
That is a great question because this book was a nameless orphan child for most of the time I was working on it. I did not have a title. It actually peeved me and worried me over the course of the time I was working on this book. This book took me 15 years. So I often say if it was a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long it took to write this book. And so for the longest time, and most of those 15 years, it did not have a title. And sometimes I would periodically stop and try to read blues lyrics, and I would read poetry from the mid 20th century, the time of the Great Migration. And then I was rereading the Black Boy. And I was reading the annotated version of Black Boy, and I was reading the end notes in the back that were describing the process through which he wrote this book. And so what happened with him was that he wrote the full book. Black Boy originally wanted it to be called American Hunger, but the Book of the Month Club decided that they did not like the second half of the book. And so they said, we will only choose this book for the Book of the Month Club, which meant a lot to him, of course, if you remove the second half, which was about his experiences in the North. And so he had to quickly figure out how was he going to close this book when half of it was missing and the conclusion that he had in mind was no longer available to him. So he ended up having to write at the very last minute, rush to come up with some ending. And in that ending was some of the most beautiful language that I think he ever came up with. And among the things that he wrote in that new ending was, I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. When I saw those words, which had been deleted from every other book, because now the book that we have, Black Boy, is now what he intended to be, the full first and second half. That is what was in the end notes, which had been lost to time. And I found it and I recovered it. I knew instantly that was the epigraph, and it was from the epigraph that the title came.
As the subtitle to your book states, this is a history of the Great Migration, which was this massive and very intentional movement of Black Americans from the South to parts of the North, parts of the West, over the course of many, many decades. What was our general understanding of the Great Migration before you published this book, and how do you think your book has led to a new and fuller understanding of it?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that I wanted to write it is because most of the research and the writing about the Great Migration had been from the standpoint of the larger perspective of the economy. What was the effect on the economy? What was the effect on poverty? There was looking at it from a policy perspective for the most part, as opposed to what was it like to be these people in the moment, in a circumstance that was untenable, in a world in which every single thing that you could and could not do was based upon what you looked like, where you fit in the hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. Time when it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together. So they were living in a world that was hard for us to imagine today, such suffocating world that they were living in. And so I wanted to be able to understand what it was like to be those people in the midst of a circumstance that was untenable and having to make this decision of their lives to leave all that they'd known for a place that they'd never seen in search of, in hopes that life might be better. So much of it was an academic perspective, larger view perspective on the system that they entered and the effect that it had on the cities from that perspective. And I wanted to understand what it was like to be those people. And I wanted readers to know what it was like to be those people.
And you also give sort of a very robust view of how long this happened in America. As you say, it took place essentially, correct me if I get the date slightly wrong, from about the 1910s to the last ones were in the late 60s or the early 70s.
Essentially from World War I until the 1970s. In other words, after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s began to take hold in the South, that's when the migration ended.
And the migration took place from the South, where, again, as you write, most Black Americans, the great majority of Black Americans lived before World War I. And then by the time the Great Migration was over, half of Black Americans lived outside of the South. It took place along 3 tracks, parts of the South to D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Boston, parts of the South to Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, parts of the South to Los Angeles and other parts of California. And in order to tell those 3 tracks, you found 3 people whose lives that you present to the reader, not only as a way of getting into the core of the thinking and the feeling of what it would take for a person to leave their home and venture into the unknown, but also to trace these 3 pathways. It must have taken you forever to find those 3 people. What was that process like?
Well, the process was to essentially have a casting call for a role of being a protagonist in my book. I went to all the places that I could think of in the North and the West where people who might have migrated would now be. Most of these people were pensioners by this time. So I went to churches in the North, like churches in Brooklyn, where everyone was from a particular part of North Carolina. I went to, there were multiple Mississippi clubs in Chicago. There was a Greenwood, Mississippi club, a Greenwood, Mississippi club, a Newton, Mississippi club, a Brookhaven, Mississippi club, a Grenada, Mississippi club. And if you were from Grenada, you didn't go to the Brookhaven club. So I was going to all the different clubs. And that's where I was hearing and getting a chance to hear and to see and to meet people who would have been part of the Great Migration. And then also out in California, there was a Juneteenth parade that I went to. There were multiple Louisiana and Texas clubs out in Los Angeles, which were all tracking with the routes that the people took in order to escape the Jim Crow South. So I went to all those places in an effort to hear as many voices, to be able to compile as many stories, but primarily to be able to identify who might ultimately be the protagonist in the book. I needed one person for each route of the Great Migration. As you mentioned, the East Coast route, the Midwest route, and out to the West. I needed to have people who have been leaving for different reasons. In other words, different precipitating causes for their particular migrations. And I needed people who were in different situations. So one was a sharecropper's wife, another one was a railroad man, and there was a surgeon who left Louisiana for California. And I also needed people who had very strong personalities so that they would stand out on the page. Because this is narrative nonfiction, and you're starting from scratch to tell true stories that will hopefully read as would a novel. And so you need all of the details and all of the material. I often call it, when I'm putting together something like this, it's like creating a quilt, and I need to pull all to get together the scraps and remnants of fabric that will ultimately become this larger quilt. And so that's the beginning process. The most important decision you make is who will you be writing about? And remembering that when you start out with something like this, when you're doing nonfiction, you don't have the full story. You hear a little bit. You hear enough to be able to give you some insight into what their personalities are like, what their general story might be like, and then what kind of storyteller are they? Are these people who have tremendous detail, have documentation of what they did? You're looking for all of those things. I narrowed it down to about 30 people. Any one of those 30 could have been the 3. But I ended up with these 3 because they were strong personalities. There was a chemistry with them. When you're doing this kind of work, I knew that this was going to be something that I was going to spend a lot of time with them. My meeting with them initially was just the very beginning. And so I was going to need people who would be there through the duration and people who would enjoy the process. And I would enjoy the process with them, but that translates into chemistry. If I felt a connection to them, then I felt that the reader would ultimately feel a connection because it would come through in the work that I was doing. And then also I was needing people who had a sense of humor because some of this material on our country's history is very difficult. And the experiences that they had some of them were so painful that they'd not told their own children some of what they had gone through. A lot of them were experiencing a kind of post-traumatic stress from what they had endured in the Jim Crow South. And so I needed to have people who also had some type of sense of humor that would help carry the story through for anyone reading it.
What did they think this was going to be? Because none of them, if I'm correct, unfortunately lived long enough to see the publication of the book. But what do you think their reason in the end, from their end, for participating was?
That was another consideration in the selection of people, because these were people who, the kind of work that I do, you're not trying to pin someone to the wall to get to talk. These are people who had to feel free, comfortable, and at peace with where they were in the world and what they'd experienced. And these are people who had a sense of history, and they were working through what their lives had been. They were at the end, toward the end of their lives. And these were people who were particularly introspective in a way that's very helpful for someone who's doing this kind of work. They were people who had somehow made peace with what they'd experienced. And they were looking to be helpful to someone who they felt a connection to, who they felt a trust in. I mean, I had earned their trust. I had spent time with them. And I think that it was a simpatico experience. I was looking to tell the story of this grand exodus of which they were a part. And then they were at the tail end of their lives seeking to share that, seeking to come to terms with what they'd experienced. So it was a wonderful pairing when it came to that. And
did you have to tailor your interview style to each of them? Was there something about the fact that they were on the older side? There's a respectful way that you speak to older people, maybe that if you're interviewing people of another generation, you would speak to them differently.
Well, I do think that when you're doing this kind of intensive ethnographic work, participant observation, you're in their world. I approach this work with a tremendous sense of gratitude for their willingness to spend time on something like this. As you mentioned, sadly, none of them lived to see the book come out. One of them, George Starling, said to me, "If you don't finish this book soon, I'm going to be poop reading from heaven." And he was right. It just took the time that it took in order to do it. And I would just say that they were, an interesting thing is that I had this idea that I could bring them together in one space because it would be a lovely thing for them all to meet. I was spending time with each one of them. You were asking me, did I change my approach with each one? I adjusted myself to what they were saying and what they were interested in doing. I might have arrived with something in mind that I wanted to cover with them, but multiple, of course, times I sat down with them. I don't view it as interviewing. I view it as spending time with them and hearing what was on their hearts and minds. And so they might take me in a totally different direction. I could not always know what I was going to be getting or what they felt like talking about. If they wanted to talk about high school, that was what we were doing. If they wanted to talk about courtship, that's what we were talking about. And so I went with them on that. I just generally absorb what they're saying, and I try to make myself the best possible listener and audience for them as they're speaking. It's a conversation. It's not my asking a question. It's not a Q&A. It's a conversation. And I just want to make it as comfortable for them to be able to share whatever's on their heart at that time. So that was my approach. But my goal of having them all together in one place, when I started this work, there was this thinking that a writer friend was telling me that you need to have them, in telling the narrative, they all need to come together at some point. And I hoped to have them come together, but they had no interest whatsoever in meeting each other. I just couldn't believe when I would talk with them about, there are two other people that I'm talking to for this book, and one of them did this, and one of them did that. They had zero interest whatsoever. In fact, they didn't even want to hear about the others. It's almost as if they felt I was cheating on them or something. So that didn't go anywhere. It ended up that they never met. They had no interest in meeting. They only meet in the pages of this book.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined this week by Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. Isabel, let's take a step or two back. You were working for the Times when you won the Pulitzer Prize for, as the citation notes, your profile of a fourth grader from Chicago's South Side, and for two stories reporting on the Midwestern flood of 1993. Sometime thereafter, you really started working on this book in earnest, and I imagine it just took over. In the end, it took you 15 years to write. What started you on that journey? Did you have any idea it would take up so much of your life, that it would be the thing that started to define that period of your life, perhaps?
I had no idea, and I would never have set out to do anything that would take 15 years ever. It's a good thing I didn't know, because I don't think I would have even started it. I could not imagine committing to something that you knew would take 15 years. So no, I had no idea. I did not plan for it to take that long. There were all kinds of things that occurred in the process of working on this. I mean, once I identified these three, first of all, it took about 18 months, a year and a half or so, to be able to find them. You're going from city to city in order to find them. And then after that, once I found them, that was just the very beginning. And then once I got started, once I began spending time with them and rotating among the three, that's another thing that took so much time. I then began to run into what's an occupational hazard in this kind of work, is that some of them began to get sick, ill, and some of them began to pass away. So I was sometimes I would land at LAX, really excited to be able to talk to Dr. Foster, was always so excited to meet with him. And instead of being able to see him in his home, I'd have to go to the hospital and sit by his bedside, and there would be absolutely, there was no research going on at that time. It was just a visit to spend time with him. That's part of the process. And so that's one of the reasons why it took so long to be able to complete this. Your question, though, was about what was the precipitating event, or how did I come up with this idea? Why did I decide to commit to what would ultimately take me 15 years? And what it was is I grew up as the daughter of people who were part of this Great Migration. I was surrounded by people growing up in Washington, D.C., whose parents and grandparents had all come up from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Florida. I was surrounded by that. I was surrounded by the language, by the accents, by the food, by the music. I was surrounded by that. And everyone I was around, people just took it for granted. Well, people were making a drive back to North Carolina over the summer. There were various things that were touch points in this migration, but no one was talking about it. No one was calling it a Great Migration. No one was acknowledging the beautiful similarities, like everybody, the parallelism among everybody's experience. No one was talking about this. Seemed as if it was just something that just popped up out of nowhere. But in fact, something like that does not happen without some kind of planning, without some type of recognition of something larger in the process of participating in it. And so I decided over time, I got further reminders. Working as the Chicago bureau chief in the Midwest, I was exposed to people who were coming from a different part of the South to Chicago, Detroit, and Michigan, a different migration stream than I was exposed to growing up in Washington, D.C. And if I was out in Los Angeles as a national correspondent, I was running into people who were from Texas and Louisiana. So those patterns became evident in everything that I was doing if I were writing about people who were African American in these cities. And after the Pulitzer, I was asked, if you were to write a book, what would it be? And there was no question in my mind. There was only one thing I wanted to write about, and that was the Great Migration. So that's how I got it.
The book has a very interesting structure. It's a history book. There's personal history. There's national history. You're cutting in between time frames as well, because each of these three main characters in the book are experiencing the Great Migration and its aftermaths in a different decade. And so you're cutting between history. How did you decide that was the way that you wanted to structure, that you wanted to cut between those people with these, and then knowing when to step back and have a chapter or a section that just tells you about the history or tells you about something that is not focusing on one of those three characters? It's a lot of puzzle pieces, but I imagine at the beginning you had to say, this is how I think it's going to look.
I actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the structure should be. Thank you so much for asking about the structure, because that is the basis for being able to tell the story. It was always going to be 3 different storylines, and then you could add a 4th, meaning the Great Migration itself. So there are like 4 characters in this braided narrative. And the question was how to make all of those pieces fit. One of the things that I decided early on is that I did not want to have one large chunk, like all of Ida May, and then all of George, and then all of Robert or Pershing. And I didn't want that because I felt it would be more repetition. You'd be reading the same thing over and over again, starting from scratch, and then with one, and going all the way from beginning to end with one, and then starting all over again with the other person. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be one seamless storyline with all of the parallel narratives all working in tandem and interwoven, so that you were with them in childhood. You were with them as they were courting, and that's the language that they would have used. All of them were together in the process of learning the world that they were in and making the decision as to whether they should stay or whether they should go. It's very important to me that the reader be experiencing all of this at the same time with each of them. And the problem was that they were doing different things, as you noted, at different times. They were born during different years. They were in different parts of the country. They were leaving for other parts of the country that were distinct and different. So there was a lot going on. And I think that structure is the one thing that kind of holds it together. It's the adhesive for any braided narrative such as this. I looked around to see if there was any other book that I could turn to, any other template that had done what I was seeking to do, and I could find no other book that did this. I spent a lot of time with W.G. Sebald's book, The Emigrants. I love that book, and I considered doing that. He carries forth each narrative on its own, and I just felt that for what I wanted to do, I wanted the reader to be with the same in the same emotional space as the protagonists were at the same time, irrespective of geography and chronology. I wanted them to be in the same space. So that is what propelled the decision to have them all in one place. I also felt that by rotating them in the way that I do, it starts with Ida May, and then it's George, and then it's Robert. Ida May, George, and Robert. Ida May, George, and Robert. And I felt that the reader could begin to follow them in the same way. I was so caught up in the imagery of all of this with the journey and the trains and the train tracks and the train wheels. And I just thought that if you followed it along, if you could get in the rhythm of these 3 people, that you could follow it and you could be with each one of them in that moment in their lives. And so what's most important is not the date that you're looking at or the location where they happen to be, but what is the emotional space where they are in their own journey.
As soon as I started this book, and I have to think that other people felt the same way, I was in, because the first line is gorgeous. The night clouds were closing in on the salt licks east of the Oxbow Lakes, along the folds in the earth beyond the Yallabusha River. Incredible, evocative. How long did you work on that opening line for?
I would have probably the cumulative amount of time was maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, a lot of time, meaning cumulative time. And I can't tell you the exact time because I was worried about it. I was thinking about it. I was pondering it. I was meditating on it for the longest time. So much of that chapter was written before I actually had the opening. I would read a lot of geological books, believe it or not. I really wanted to, I spent a lot of time reading about the land, about the ways you describe the land, the geological, scientific descriptions of the land. I found that language to be so evocative and poetic in its own way. I actually bought a used geological dictionary. That's how deeply I got into it. The same goes for the title. I wasn't sold on the title. I was always thinking. And I started to do a lot of astronomy. I was reading a lot of astronomy. I got into it so deeply that I was reading about Hubble. Like I read the biographies of Hubble. This is the detail. That's why it took me 15 years. So every single sentence is deep with research in every way. Multiple books might go into every single sentence.
That's incredible and somewhat overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here with Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns. Isabel, you write over and over again, it keeps coming up, about this publication, the Chicago Defender. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what was a Defender, what it meant to people at the time, and how you were able to access its archives in the ways that I assume that you were.
The Chicago Defender was the repository of the news and the hopes and the dreams of the people, because it was giving them a window into what one of the places that they wanted to get to was actually like. It gave them a sense of what were they entering to the degree that was possible. And it was also kind of like the Facebook of the migration, you might say, because this was a way of being able to learn about what were the jobs that were available, what were the rents like in the place that they wanted to go. It was something that allowed them to picture what it might be like. Of course, there was no internet to be able to look these things up. It's incredible, the limited amount of information upon which they had to depend in order to make these decisions these life and death decisions that they had to make. The Chicago Defender also was considered contraband in the South. It was very hard for them to get a copy. Parts of the South was very, very difficult. It was banned material that could be very dangerous to be able to get a copy of. It was the Pullman porters who would essentially deliver the Chicago Defender and also the Pittsburgh Courier and some other northern papers at predetermined locations. They would drop it off from the train as a train was making its way through some of these towns in the South, and then people would know where to pick it up. So it was like the beacon of hope for them, and because they were in very isolated locations and would have no other way of really understanding what the North was like before they made the journey.
You talk about how the Chicago Defender was sort of like the Facebook of its day. We're talking about a million years pre-internet. However, you were also doing your research in the earliest years of the book, certainly before the height of the internet. I have to imagine that, as I mentioned, finding archives, finding letters, finding the equivalent of the Chicago Defender in other cities that were along the Great Migration Trails. How was doing research then? I'm talking like this was a million years ago, different from what it's like to just Google now, you know?
It was before Google. Google came out, I think, in the mid-90s, and this was pre-Google. And even when Google started, it did not have all of the access and all the materials that we now take for granted. So essentially, it was microfilm and microfiche. That was old school, going into those darkened spaces in a library and having to get that. It would always be these strips that would snap when you're trying to roll it through. I mean, old school, hard to believe now. Having to send away. I remember having to send away for materials for used books, from old books that had no access to otherwise. I remember being so excited to get an actual copy of one of the most famous papers ever written about migration by a man named Ravenstein out of London in the late 19th century. It was such a joy to be able to get these things. They were so precious to me because it took so much energy to get your hands on anything. And that's another reason why it took 15 years. This was old school, before we could just type in a question about what was Chickasaw County, what was the population of Chickasaw County, Mississippi. We could just look that up now. That was not possible in those days. So that's another reason it took so long. It had to be done the way that it was, because for narrative nonfiction, which is a genre in which you're seeking you're doing all the research that's necessary for any nonfiction work. And then you're translating all of that material, all those facts, all of that data into something that is a narrative that anyone could potentially read as they would a novel. You want it to be page turning. You want it to be based on character, protagonist, suspense. There's a lot of suspense in the book. All of that can only be done if you have the information, material, the facts, the history upon which to build it. And that's why something like this, most of the time is spent just getting the material that you need in order to create the quilt that you ultimately want to write.
Before writing this book, you were a reporter, not, I could say this from having worked in journalism for a while, not every reporter is a great writer. That's totally fine. It happens. You won a Pulitzer for feature writing. We know you were a good writer, but there's a leap between writing a series, writing articles, and then writing a book of this length. You maybe had a sense that you could do the research, do the reporting, but when it came to the writing, when it came to that, really trying to find the language to make it propulsive, to never make it feel like a history textbook, what were your concerns, your fears around that?
It was my first book. Hard to believe it's my first book. I had grand ambitions for what it could be. I could picture what it could be. The issue was, how am I going to harness all that I had faith in? How could I harness all that into a cohesive whole? And once I had the structure, then I could move forward. I did not have an outline. It's interesting. Some people have outlines. I wrote it with the sense of it had to be organic. So it wasn't, I wanted to have an outline, but that just was not going to work. So I found that I was writing it and I would get a sense of, when should I stop this and then start with someone else? It was really intuitive when it came to that. I wish that there was a way that I could say, this is how I made the decision to stop at this point. I loved the idea of being able to build the suspense. It was really, I think what carried me through was just the challenge of being able to do it. I knew it could be done, and I just had to focus on what was it going to take to get this done. For whatever reason, I had no doubt that it could be done. I just had to figure out what was it going to take. Again, that's going back to the material. It goes back to the people. It goes back to, even once the people passed away, that was even more inspiration for me to be able to get this done. It just meant that I now had a responsibility to make the trust that they had in me worth something. I had to convert this into something that would be worthy of the trust that they had. So that was what was fueling me through. And I would say that writing is always one word followed by another word, followed by another word, to make a sentence that will create a paragraph, that will create a scene. It is really not that different. It really is. And that was what carried me through, is that I'd been doing mainly narrative for the Times in the last years that I was there. And it felt like a very natural transition into something, just extending it into a larger arena. But it's basically the same challenge that any writer has. One word followed by another word, followed by another word, as evocative, as poetic, as lyrical, as vibrant as you possibly can make it. And then write that next sentence, and there you go.
It's been a few years since this book came out. I'm wondering, particularly since you've been able to publish another book since, how you look back on it now, how you look back on its publication, how it was received, and then in the years since, how people talk to you about it, what you think it put into the world.
It's been 14 years, and I have actually been on the road with this book almost the entire time, with the exception of COVID, and then we were doing Zooms. So it has had a really long lifespan that I could never have anticipated. The goal was to finish it, and I had no idea how it would move about in the world. One of the things that it's become a kind of validation for the people who were part of this great migration, who often did not speak about it to their own children. And it's given them the kind of a platform through which to share their experiences. And that's been such a fulfilling experience to have. But also, because the people have gotten up in age, many of the people have passed away who were part of this great migration. I will often hear from the children and grandchildren, and sometimes they will say to me, with joy in their hearts, but also tearfully, they will say to me with gratitude that this book was the last book that their mother or their father, their grandparent happened to have read before they left this planet. And when they say that, it's deeply meaningful to me, because it's saying that at the end of these people's lives, they had had a chance to have this kind of conclusion, this kind of circular acceptance of the role that they had and a sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. And I take that as one of the unexpected honors of this work.
Isabel, I have asked all the other authors who've participated in this series to talk about the book that they have read the most over the course of their lives. I'd love to hear yours.
let me just start by saying that with nonfiction, we often don't get the luxury of being able to read books over many, many times over. I speak for myself, is that I read so many books for the work itself, much of it being nonfiction, meaning history books or other books, sociology books, whatever it may be. So I often don't get the chance to read books over and over, although I would love to. I also don't get a chance to read novels as much as I might like because I'm so focused on the work. But the book that I would point out as the one that I've read most deeply is a book that has some challenges because it has some problematic aspects to it, but it is The Grapes of Wrath. And I mention The Grapes of Wrath because this was the book that showed me that writing The Warmth of the Suns was possible. And that's because it is gorgeously written. It's got some problematic aspects to it. It has problematic depictions of African Americans, problematic depictions of women. And the ending is very controversial. It always was from the time it was released. And I am not really a fan of the ending, but it's beautifully, beautifully written, as we all know. Of course, it's a classic. But the meaning for me is that I had to study it in order to find a way to tell the story of the Great Migration in a way that would allow me to have the narrative flow through without disruption and still be able to tell the larger story of Great Migration. And one of the things that he does with this book is that he has interchapters. And those interchapters are gorgeously, gorgeously written. In my view, that they're the most beautiful part of the book. And in those, he tells the larger story of what's going on at the time, where the bankers are closing in or where they're looking out at the land and they're seeing it turn to dust. And those are the beautifully poetic and evocative interchapters that allowed me to be able to see that could be possible, that I could tell the story. My narrative was going to be very complex with 3 different stories. He's telling 1, I'm telling 3. And I needed to be able to know, how can I tell the larger story? I call them setback chapters. I call them interchapters. Those are woven in the book, in between the narratives without disrupting the narrative. And that's the beauty of this book for me. Another thing is that Steinbeck had been a journalist before he started to work on The Grapes of Wrath. He wrote in the mid-1930s for a newspaper about the migrant camps and experiences that they'd had. And then he decided he wanted to do something larger. And that's how he began his work on the Grapes of Wrath. So I felt a connection there. Also, it turned out that he had a lot of trouble coming up with the title. He spent a lot of time worried about the title, as had I. And in his case, his wife came up with the title, and it was from the song Battle Hymn of the Republic. I ended up getting it from my title came out of the words of Richard Wright. So I felt a connection with this book. Problematic though it is, I feel that it showed me that there was a template that didn't exist elsewhere as to how I could write The Warmth of Other Suns.
I think that's a great choice, problematic as it is. Isabel Wilkerson, not problematic, is The Warmth of Other Suns, which remains just an amazing accomplishment. It is all these years later. Thank you so much for joining us at the Book Review Podcast to talk about it and to reflect upon it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Isabel Wilkerson, author of the book The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, the best nonfiction book of this century, as chosen by the participants of our recent poll. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.